Thank you. So then let's roll this. Welcome to this 45-minute session where I will talk a little bit about a project called Bicep that has been introduced last year. What is important is, 45 minutes is literally nothing to talk about this topic, but the goal here is really to give you an introduction what Bicep is, where it can actually help you becoming more productive, more efficient when it comes to infrastructure as code. When you deploy resources, when you deploy services to the Azure platform. All right, so let's directly continue with that. Some words about myself. So my name is Marcel. I operate out of Switzerland. This is where I am right now. So in the beautiful city of Bern, and I work for SoftwareOne. I am the team lead of a Microsoft Cloud team that is located in Switzerland, and we take care of customers all over the DACH region. And we cover everything Azure and M365. And then, of course, that whole infrastructure as code story is a very important building block. So it's a principle we follow whenever possible, whenever the customer actually also wants this and is able to understand and manage it. Beside my regular work, I'm Microsoft MVP for Azure, and I'm a regional director as well. So I'm deeply involved with communities and with Microsoft, and try to be like the man in the middle to bring the community questions or asks or complaints or whatever directly to Microsoft. All right, so what to expect in the next 45 minutes. As I said, it's an introduction session. So if you already played with Bicep, if you are an infrastructure as code specialist, don't expect too much deepness here. So my goal is really to introduce you into this Bicep concept, what it is, how it works, so that you can then start your own journey and start packing your own bag with a Bicep specific knowledge. So today we'll really discuss about the basics to lift your Bicep skills from level 0 or from very little to something around 150. And I will do lots of demos, so I only have very few slides because I want to really show you how this works, how it feels if you deploy your infrastructure using Bicep. All right. As I said, what not to expect. We will not have a look what infra as code means, why it's a good idea to think about it. We will not deep dive into anything. We will not cover like the full DevOps story, such as pipelines or repository management and so on. So it's really about the functionality of Bicep. All right. Good. So some things to are important to understand before you start your Bicep journey. So this is all about deploying Azure infrastructure, Azure services, Azure configurations to the Azure platform by describing the services and the configurations as code, right? So that it's reusable and so on. And in Azure, we have this thing called ARM, or the Azure Resource Manager. And what Azure Resource Manager does is it's a service that sits under the covers, and it's used for all deployments, for all the management that you are actually doing in Azure. So whenever you provision something, whenever you stop or start a virtual machine, whenever you configure a resource and change some settings, whenever you delete something, this is all done by Azure Resource Manager under the covers for you. And no matter how you actually talk to the Azure platform, no matter if you use the Azure portal, if you use the Azure CLI, if you use PowerShell scripts, if you use ARM templates or something, at the very end, it's always Azure Resource Manager that takes care of the doing for you, right? And that means that whatever you do, whatever tools you use, we can be sure that everything we do and all our authorization, our permissions and privileges are consistent across the board. So this is Azure Resource Manager. When we dive a little bit deeper, and that's by far the deepest architecture slide I will show you today, you have to understand that in Azure, we have so-called resource providers. So for now, I don't know exactly. It's something between 150 and 200, I assume. I don't know the exact number. But these are the names of the resource providers. So for instance, Microsoft Storage, Microsoft Compute, Microsoft SQL, Microsoft Network, for the Microsoft technologies. And there we have, of course, also some resource provider from third parties. But what's the job or the task of a resource provider? Well, every resource provider is responsible to manage certain specific Azure resource types. So if you take a look at the compute provider here, for instance, this guy is responsible for managing disks, because that's a compute element. This resource provider is responsible for managing virtual machines. So if you deploy a virtual machine, this is done by the Microsoft Compute resource provider. If you create availability sets, scale sets, and so on, this is all done by the Microsoft Compute provider. For storage, for instance, this resource provider is responsible for managing storage accounts, right? And whenever a resource provider needs to somehow manage or touch a resource, no matter if it's like an initial deployment, if it's a configuration or deletion process, it uses a specific resource provider operations to touch the resource. So write if something needs to be created or changed, read obviously if some information needs to be gathered from an already existing resource, or of course delete if something needs to be deleted. Right? So this is what happens under the covers. And your let's say your front door or your single entry door to talk to all of these resource providers is actually ARM, or Azure Resource Manager. So that's our entry point. And no matter, as I said, how we talk to Azure, no matter if we use the Azure portal to provision a virtual machine, if we use the Azure CLI, or if we use an ARM template, it will always go through Azure Resource Manager. And Azure Resource Manager will then talk to the different resource providers and assign the appropriate actions to do whatever we want to do, such as provisioning a new virtual machine. So this is a very important overview, so that you can later better understand how this infrastructure as code story works with Bicep, and also with ARM templates, of course. Now, if you already worked with Azure, you might have heard of ARM templates. And it's a kind of a different approach to talk to the Azure platform, because ARM templates allow us to follow a declarative approach, which means that we don't have, let's say, a simple PowerShell script where we have a sequence of commands that do something for us, but we have a declarative approach, which means that we describe how the end goal should look like, and then we hand over this descriptive configuration to the platform, and then Azure Resource Manager will take care to do whatever is needed to make this happen, what we actually described, right? So we don't care too much how things are done. We just describe what we want, and Azure Resource Manager takes care of the rest. So ARM templates have been around for many years, and if you already played with ARM templates, you know that it can be a little bit of a struggle, because ARM templates use JSON format, and JSON format is well, it's kind of human readable, but it's still not so human friendly. It was never invented to be human readable. It's normally used for machine to machine or service to service communications. But it is still somewhat human readable, right? But not really friendly. And so during my work with Azure in the last decade, I recognize that lots of our customers and also lots of engineers that work with the Azure platform, they somewhat struggle with developing ARM templates, because it can become very, very complex. And the more complex a configuration gets, the more unreadable and the more intransparent it gets. So it's very hard to manage. And if you don't use it like on a regular basis, then it's pretty tough. So now what Microsoft wants us to be able is to become much more productive. And this is why Bicep was actually launched. So let's have a look what Bicep is. So Bicep is a new DSL, or domain-specific language, or kind of a transpiler, which means that we use a specific language to describe our configuration And this is then translated in ARM templates for us, and then the ARM templates are deployed. So it's like another abstraction layer that makes the usage of ARM templates easier for us. They will still be around. So ARM templates is still the only thing that at the very end can be used for declarative approach when you talk to the Azure platform natively. So Bicep is not kind of a new communication or something. It's just an abstraction layer that sits in front of ARM templates. And this is how it looks like more or less. So this is what we already know. So back in the days, we created our ARM templates, and then we somehow handed over that configuration to the Azure Resource Manager, and then Azure Resource Manager did the job, obviously. And now when we talk about Bicep, as I said, it's just another abstraction that sits from the order, it sits in front of the ARM templates. So that means we describe everything in Bicep, which should be much easier, and you will see in a bit. Then this configuration gets compiled into an ARM template. And there's a compiler that does all that hard work for us, so we don't have to care too much. And then we still deploy the ARM templates. And now the cool thing with the current Azure CLI and Bicep CLI version, this can all be done in a single step. So before, back in the days, we had to write Bicep configuration files. Then we first had to compile them into ARM templates, and then we had to deploy the ARM templates. These days, we can just write a Bicep file and deploy the Bicep file directly onto the Azure platform. And the compilation and the ARM template creation and then the handover of the ARM template to the platform is done all in one step. So we don't have to worry too much about that. So this makes it even much easier for us. Now, as with everything, if we start working with Bicep, we need kind of a proper tooling. And that means that, well, we want to have some help that allows us to write Bicep configurations quickly and also configurations that are rock solid from the very beginning, so that the chances are very high that they compile properly. And for that, you get a great extension for Visual Studio Code. So if this is your tool of choice, you should definitely install the Bicep extension because it supports you with everything Bicep configs inside Visual Studio Code. So this is a vital extension that you will need. And then, as I said, we then somehow need a process to compile these Bicep configurations into ARM templates. And for that, we have the Bicep CLI, which used to be a standalone CLI. You had to download and install, and that's still available. But starting with a specific version I will show you later, this is now also integrated into the Azure CLI, which makes it even more easier. So we can use the Bicep CLI from within the Azure CLI now to directly deploy our configurations to the Azure platform. All right, so that's more or less it from the slides side of things. So now let's change to the demo because I want to show you how this works. All right, so this is Visual Studio Code, and I will quickly just introduce it to the tooling. If you worked with Visual Studio Code before, you know that there's this thing called extensions, and somewhere in here, you should see that I have this Bicep extension installed. Comes for free, and it gives you all these cool things such as syntax verification, IntelliSense, and so on, to become much faster when it comes to writing Bicep configuration files. So this is a must if you use Visual Studio Code. All right, and then the second thing is the Bicep CLI. And as I said, you can still download this as a standalone version, but I would suggest that you use the integrated version of the Azure CLI. There's also a version available for PowerShell. So no matter if you prefer using the Azure CLI or the PowerShell modules to talk to the Azure platform, the Bicep CLI is now integrated into both. And just to quickly show you, the requirement that that you need to fulfill is this. So you need to have at least the Azure CLI version 2.20. So if you have Azure CLI version 220 or later, then you're good to go to also use the integrated Bicep extension. If you never use the Bicep extension inside the Azure CLI, it will install automatically the first time the Azure CLI thinks it is needed. So you don't have to do anything, but still you can install it manually by just hitting this. So AZ Bicep and then install. And this will install the CLI. Or if you just do, because I already installed it in my case, AZ Bicep version, you can see that I'm now on version 04.1. So this is installed now in my case. And that's all that's needed. Of course, you obviously also need kind of an Azure subscription and an Azure account, but that's obvious. So now let's see how this is done, how you can start putting your hands on Bicep. So in demo 1, I will create a brand new file. So I have nothing prepared. I'll just call this demo 1, and I use the .bicep extension. And as you can see, because I have the extension installed, it gives me this nice icon. And on the right-hand side here, I can also see that this is already recognized as a Bicep file because the extension is installed, right? What that means, I now get all the cool help from this extension. And if I just hit Control Space, this already gives me some options, some keywords that I could use to now start writing my Bicep configuration. And now the most important keyword you will be using for Bicep configurations obviously is resource, because the resource keyword gives you the option to describe a resource that you want to provision or that you want to configure. So I just start by hitting resource. And as you can see, it gives me several options. So I can just use the blank resource keyword, or I could use some help that already gives me some code fragments or code skeletons. For now, I go slim and I just select the resource keyword. All right. Now, every resource needs kind of a symbolic name, and we'll see later why this is needed. So this is a name I just used inside the Bicep configuration. It will never be used when something is deployed, so it will never be shown on the Azure platform or something. This is just Bicep internally. And I will follow a very simple example here. I will just deploy a regular storage account. So I will give this the symbolic name STO for storage. Right. Now, as I showed you before, at the very end, to deploy a storage account, I need to talk to the proper resource provider. And now, as I know, well, I want to provision a storage account, I just start typing storage. And the extension gives me all the different options. And you can immediately see now that I get this format saying, well, Microsoft.storage, which is the name of the resource provider, and then slash, and then the name of the resource type. And this is exactly what I'm interested in. So I want to deploy a storage account through the Microsoft storage provider. So I'll pick this. And if I pick this, it will also ask me, well, what API version of this resource provider do you want to talk to? Because you can imagine the functionality of the different Azure resources is extended over time. So we get more and more and more features into the different resources. And that also means that Microsoft needs to release new API versions of the different resource providers. And it's always up to me to decide what API version I want to talk to. Now, of course, normally you would also always go for the latest version, especially if you start. But with that selection, it's your choice, and you're absolutely in full control what API version you want to talk to. So the latest versions normally give you most of the functionality. So resource, symbolic name, and then what type of resource do I want to deploy, and what API version do I want to talk to. And continuing from there, I can now start filling in the different properties for my storage account. And again, before I do so, I get some help. So I can start naked and totally empty. Or again, I, for instance, could say, well, I already want to display the required properties because a storage account offers tons of properties, but only very few are required. If I just pick this, it's now up to me to decide. As you can see, it's just curly braces and everything is blank. But if I pick this, for instance, required properties, it already gives me all the properties I need to use to successfully deploy the storage account. All right, so that's the minimum, these 4 properties. Now the name, because this is a name, just a string, I just enter something like that. So STO and some number, because we all know that the storage account needs to have a unique name. Location, in my case, I just pick West Europe, right? And then the SKU and the kind. So the SKU is the definition how that storage account will replicate the data that you will store inside this virtual storage. And I don't even have to consult the documentation, because if I just hit Control and space, it already gives me the valid options that the resource provider understands. So it tells me, well, you can pick standard locally redundant storage or standard globally redundant storage. These are the valid options. And for now, I just pick one of them. If I would pick something else, that of course would fail. So if I would deploy this, the storage, the resource provider wouldn't understand it and it will fail. But because I get this help from the extension, this makes it much more solid for me. And the same is true for kind. These are the different kinds of storage accounts I can create. For now, I just pick storage v2. And that's it. So I just save this file now, right? And that's the minimum I need to submit. Now, as you can see, I still have this Bicep file, and I'm now sitting in this folder, demo01. And if I do just a dir, I can see this is my demo01 file. So there's nothing in there now. And what I could do now is I could now compile this Bicep file into an ARM template by just saying az bicep build -f, which means file. Which file do you want to compile or build? And this is my demo1 Bicep file. So please create an ARM template out of this. Takes a few seconds. And now you can see that this properly compiled into a JSON file. And if I open this, this is a proper ARM template. All right. And this could now be deployed to the Azure platform. But now, as we said, we can do all in one single go. I'm maybe not even interested in the ARM templates itself. So let's just delete that, because we want to go the direct way. And that will now hand over my configuration to the Azure platform. And if you have done this with ARM templates before, you know you can use the Azure CLI or PowerShell to do that. I prefer to use the Azure CLI, but it doesn't really matter. And if you want to hand over an ARM template configuration, you use this deployment element. So AZ deployment, which means I want to create a new deployment. And now I need to define where this code should be deployed to. There are several different scopes that are supported in Azure. So you can deploy something into a resource group. You can deploy something at subscription level or at management group level or even at tenant level. So, but because I deploy a resource here, this is always a resource group level deployment. So I need to deploy this into a resource group. Because I want to do that, I select AZ deployment group. This is a resource group level deployment. And then I use the create keyword saying, well, I want to create a new deployment. And now I need 2 parameters. So one is the file. And this is where you would normally add your ARM template. But because I have this integrated Bicep CLI inside the Azure CLI, I can now directly submit the Bicep configuration. So I don't need this whole compilation process. And then the second is the resource group. So what resource group should this go into? And if I quickly go to my portal, I've been locked out, so hold on a second. Yeah, to re-enter the password. And MFA again. All right. There we are. You can now see that if I go to my resource groups, the only thing I have is an empty demo 01 resource group. Nothing is in there, so it's totally empty. And if I now deploy this into this resource group, this starts a new deployment. So what actually happens behind the scene, all right, this is also expired. So let me quickly relog in here as well. That's wrong. Once again. Just give me a second. There we go. So because I do this interactively, I just logged in with my regular admin account. And now just to be sure, because I have multiple subscriptions, I also need to make sure that I target the correct subscription. So let me quickly do that. And the subscription I'm using is this. All right, because otherwise, if I don't select the subscription, it might not be able to find my resource group demo 01. And now if I just retrigger this saying, now please deploy into demo 01, this should now compile this file in the background to an ARM template, hand over the ARM template to the Azure platform, and now create a deployment. So let's see if that is true. This is now running. It will take approx 30 seconds to do so. So let's go back to the portal here. And I'm now, as I said, in my resource group here. All right. And if you have a look at the settings of the resource group, you can see deployments, right? And there you can see all the ARM template deployments. So if I click on this, I should now see that a deployment just happened. As you can see there, this is from right now. The file or the deployment name is based on the file name, which is demo01. And I could even click on that and get some more details saying, well, okay, this obviously is completed. I have no specific input parameters. I have no output parameters because it's all hard-coded. We'll take a look at that in a second. And if I go to the template, I can see what template has been deployed, right? And as we can see now, this is an ARM template. So it's not the Bicep file itself. Compilation happened before it was built into an ARM template, and then the ARM template was deployed. All right, so now we should actually see our storage account here, and there it is. Right? As simple as that. Only a few lines of code. Pretty simple to follow this example, right? Now, it's also important, infrastructure as code is not only for initial provisioning, but it's also for service maintenance. So because imagine you have this code and you deployed this onto the Azure platform, and that storage account is now used in production, but now you want to change certain configurations. I could go back into my code here and now change something. Right? So if I just extend my code now, if I hit Control Space, this tells me, well, you could obviously configure dependencies, you could configure identities, you can add properties, and you can add tags. So in my case, I will just add some properties. So let's add this. All right. And now you can see all the properties that I can select from. Again, everything prepared for me and pretty simple to use. Let's say I want to configure the access tier. Because I didn't configure the access tier in the first place, it just automatically picked hot because hot is the default. But now I want to change this to cool. So I select cool. And as you've seen, I get the valid options here as well. And then let's also pick allowed shared key access. This allows me to enable or disable the storage account access keys. By default, they're enabled. In my case, I can see false or true. I want to disable them. I save the file, and I fire the exact same comment again, but this time, because we are now touching a production environment, I want to first really understand what would be changed now before I really deploy and release this code to the platform. So I could add this parameter, which is C, it stands for confirm. And what this does is it analyzes if that storage account already exists, which is true in our case, and it will check the configuration of the storage account, compare it to our code, and it will, well, should now tell us, well, if you would release this code to the platform, this is what would change now. And as you can see there, I can see one resource would be changed, which is our storage account with this name, obviously. And then the allowed shared key access would change to false, and hot would also change to cool. Are you sure you want this? So this gives me this additional safety net that allows me to first have a look and then decide and decide, well, yes, this is exactly what I expected to happen. So let's deploy this. And this would now just change the two properties on my already existing storage account. So let's see if that already happened. I assume this is already done. If I go to the configuration of my storage account down here, we should already see, I guess, yeah. This is now already cool, and yeah, exactly. The account key access is already disabled. So both of the options were different before. So done. Again, if interested, I can quickly have a look at the deployment, and I would see, yeah, 130, this deployed successfully. All right. Now to keep this very simple, I will again remove this. But now, of course, I mean, this very simple Bicep file, it contains all hard-coded values, and that's not normally what we use. We want to write code that is super flexible, that is parameterized. And this is why I now add a second area to this Bicep file and define my parameter files. And for that, I have this parameter or param keyword, which allows me to define a parameter. For instance, I give each parameter a name, the name of the storage account. And as you can see now, it tells me, well, please let me know, is this a parameter of type bool or an integer or a string? We know, well, the name obviously is a string. So let's define this as a string. There we go. And that's it. And I can just repeat that for all the other parameters. One is location, the next is the SKU, and the next is the kind, right? All are strings. And now I just need to change my code saying, well, please don't use a hard-coded value here, but when this is deployed the next time, someone will submit a value for the parameter name, and this value should be used to deploy that storage account. So I will remove that, and I just fill in the name parameter. And if I hover over this, you can see that it automatically recognizes, well, this obviously is the name from the parameter name. So I will fill in that value. Same is true for location. That, okay. This is the SKU, and this is the kind. Oops, not good. There we go. Save this, and we're good to go. Now our file is totally parameterized. And if I fire this, oops, I have a small typo. There we go. If I do this, I remove the confirm now, right? It now recognizes, well, there's some values missing now. So please give me a value for the parameter name. Enter something. And this can be done through the command line now. If I just enter something like this, will then ask me for location, ask me for the SKU, and ask me for the kind, storage v2. And now it submits. And with that, I can reuse the same code over and over again just by submitting different values. And now, of course, I could store these values in the parameters file and then submit that parameters file when I deploy my Bicep file as well, so that I don't have to use the command line to enter all of these values. So now that deploys a new storage account with that name. All the rest will be the same, but this adds flexibility. And then, of course, I can also configure my parameters. So let's say for SKU, we learned that I have to use specific strings, right? Such as standard LRS or standard GRS or something like that. So if I would submit something different, the deployment would fail. And so why not configuring that parameter to only allow specific values? I know that they will work. And that can be done by using so-called decorators. So for this parameter, I can now add a decorator, and you can see what is allowed. So I can set allowed values that I'm allowed to use. I can set a description so that I can add some description to the code, what this parameter, for instance, is used for. I can add a max length or a minimum length, or I can mark this as a secure string or something. So for now, I would just configure the allowed values. And because I want to add multiple allowed values, I just configure this as an array. And now I could say, well, one allowed value I know is this, right? And the second allowed value would be this. So this is all that is allowed for my deployment for this SKU parameter. Now, if I deploy this again, let's see how this works. Of course, first it again asks me for a name. This location, same thing. Now it tells me, well, please submit the value for SKU. You could either choose LRS or GRS. What do you want, 1 or 2? So let's pick 2. And then we continue from there. The same could be done for kind. And for instance, I could also automatically fill in default values. So for instance, if I normally deploy to the West Europe region, I could set a default value for the location parameter saying, well, if I don't submit a specific value, please use this all the time. All right, and this automatically sets the default value. If I want, I can submit a different location. If I don't submit anything, it will use West Europe. All right, and with that, I could continue over and over again. So let's again kill this. All right, and add another thing. Let me quickly check time. Yeah, I still have some minutes. I want to introduce it to something else, which is called a variable. So parameters are normally things that are submitted during runtime. So when I deploy my Bicep file or my ARM template, I have to submit a parameter value, right? But now maybe that's not the final value I want to use somewhere down in my code, but maybe I want to somehow change the value first, extend the value with some other string or somehow calculate the value before I use the new value inside of my code. And that can be done by using variables. So variables are executed at runtime. They calculate some value that can later be used inside my code. And the principle is the same. I give it a name, in this case, the final name, right? And then I could define, well, what to do now. So what kind of calculation do I actually want, right? And now I can start, for instance, saying, well, I want to automatically calculate the name of the storage account. So this name I submit during runtime, this is not the full name, but it's more a prefix name. All right. And if I have a prefix that I will submit, I will then somehow concatenate this prefix with some other value. And this could be calculated in a variable. And then finally, if I would do this, I could then, for instance, in the name of the resource, I could then say, well, I don't want to pick this prefix name, but I want to use the variable final name that has been calculated for me, right? And of course, it tells me, well, this variable is empty. Somehow this is not working because, of course, I would need to configure the variable first by concatenating some name. All right, so that means you can start pretty slim and then continue from there. And now, of course, this is still a very simple example. And this is why I go to the next demo where I prepared some more complex code, still pretty much simple, but I want to introduce you to some other concept. And this is the concept of using modules. So Bicep understands and supports this modular concept, which allows me to reuse code inside a Bicep configuration. So what does that mean? So for instance, here you can see that I have 4 modules, and modules are also Bicep files, right? So the same code principle I showed you before. And as you can see, I have one module for a network security group. I have one module to deploy a virtual network. I have one module to deploy a virtual network subnet. And obviously, This is exactly what I want to do. Deploy a virtual network, add a subnet to the network, deploy a network security group, and then assign it to my subnet. That's the scenario here. And then I have another module that just deploys multiple storage accounts somehow. So let's take a look at the modules. Let's pick this first because that's very simple. Network security group, as you can see, it deploys one resource. Symbolic name is NSG. The type is Microsoft Network / network security groups. That's the latest resource provider API, and that's the minimum that is needed, the location and the name. And you can see this is parameterized up here. Location is West Europe, and the name parameter is empty, so I need to submit this during deployment time. Now you can see another concept here, which is output, because parameters are kind of input values that I input during the deployment or during runtime. Output is what happens after the deployment worked. So it gives me back some values. So for instance, here I defined, well, please define one output. This is again the symbolic name. It's a string. And then as you can see here, I now reference to this resource up here. And this is why the symbolic names are used, which means I want to output something from the network security group I created. And what property do you want to output? The ID value. Pretty simple. Network, same. The only thing is we have a location, a name, and as well a properties area where we need to submit some IP address prefixes. And it gives me at the very end back the virtual network ID. Subnet, same thing. The only specialty here is that a subnet is a child resource of a virtual network. And so that means that if I deploy the subnet, and you can see it here because it now says virtual network / subnets. So it's kind of a child object of a virtual network. I need to define the parent object. So what is the parent object of my subnet that I want to deploy? And as you can see, again, I use a reference. And if I scroll up a little bit in here, I defined a resource of type virtual network. And I said, well, this resource is already existing. I don't deploy it in this code. The virtual network already sits somewhere, and this is the name of the virtual network. So it kind of attaches this already deployed virtual network and then uses that information down here to understand that the subnet I want to deploy now is kind of a child resource of my virtual network. So these are the three modules that I'm using. Each module deploys one single resource. And then I also created, just as an example, kind of a special module that deploys multiple storage accounts. And you can see resource STO, it deploys a storage account, so nothing special here. But now you can see this goes into a loop. So it does not just deploy one storage account, but multiple. So the for keyword is used to loop. And you can see it uses this range 1 up to a parameter value amount. And amount is a number that I will submit when I deploy this. So I could deploy 100 storage accounts at the same time in a loop if I want, right? The location will be parameterized. And now, of course, because I deploy more than one storage account, I need some magic to name the storage account, because obviously each storage account would need a different name. And so that means I'm using some magic here, using a prefix, right, which is this one here. It's a variable I stored here. So it's always STO. So it uses STO, and then it uses some hashing function to create a unique hash. And then it adds the index of my loop. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 100. So modules can deploy based on some logic if you want, right? Now, these are the different modules, but now I want to use the modules in a new deployment. So I created a new file here, which is demo02. And if I go in there, you can see what I did here. So first I said, well, the first resource I want to deploy is a resource group. So an empty resource group. I hard-coded the values here. Again, I could parameterize those, but here they are hard-coded. So this should create a demo02 resource group. And once this is done, I'm using my 4 modules to deploy one network security group. You can see I'm using the module keyword here saying, well, this is the module I want to use. That's the file of the module, and it's in the folder modules, right? So in here. And then it tells me, well, what resource group do you want to deploy this resource to, right? And I deploy this into this scope, RGR01, which is the symbolic name of the resource group I deployed in the first place. So that means I will deploy the resource group and then directly deploy the network security group into this new resource group. And then, of course, I need to submit the parameters value that this module is expecting. Now, for NSG, it's only the name. If I create a virtual network, it asks me for a prefix. If I deploy the subnet, it will ask me for the parent and the subnet IDs. And finally, I also deploy that storage account. And I said, I want to have an amount of 9 storage accounts. So it will loop through 9 times. So let's see if that works. Well, let me go to demo 02. Here, there it is, my Bicep file. And if I deploy this now, we have now as a specialty is because this also contains a resource group. I cannot create a resource group deployment. So I need to deploy this onto the subscription level. So the command is a little bit different. It's still AZ deployment, but now I create a subscription level deployment, right? And then, of course, again, I need to define the file I'm interested in, and I need to define the location, which is, again, West Europe. So let's see if this deploys. Oops, wrong. What's the matter here? Spelled, what is that? Confused now. Right. Recognized by the system. That's weird. As it obviously is there. Oh, that's strange. All right, so maybe let's quickly create a new file because I really don't see the issue here. Bicep, let's pull this over to demo. Strange. Ah, okay. All right. I forgot this keyword, of course. This is it. Now let's go back to demo. Yeah, let's pick that one. Same code. I forgot to add the create keyword, so it didn't know, well, do I need to create a new deployment or delete a deployment or something? So now it knows, and now it should find the file. Now, don't forget, we now create a subscription level deployment. So if I go back to my portal, I need to go to the subscription level first to check my deployment. So this is my subscription, right? If I go there, I should see deployment somewhere here. And I can now see, aha, this is deploying right now. So obviously it is deploying something. If I go in there, I can see all the details. I can have a look at the template. And as you can see, this is starting to get a bit complex. So the full template is now already 300 lines of code almost. And as you can see, the readability is somehow impacted, right? But now we also know, well, this deployed a resource group, and then inside this resource group, it deployed some resources. So let's also go to the resource group here, see if demo 02 has been created. Yeah, obviously, yes. And after it has been created, it deployed several resources in there. So let's see if they're already there. And we can see, yeah, the virtual network is there. If I go in there, this should have a subnet. True, and this subnet should have the network security group assigned. And as you can see here, this is also very much true. And beside that, it deployed 9 storage accounts, right? I could also see that here. And I can see, okay, everything has been deployed successfully. So this is more or less it. What I wanted to show you, quick and dirty, like a very slim kickstart into Bicep. I really encourage you to have a look. It's super powerful, and what is also very important, if talking about Bicep, we now talk about version 0.4. And the cool thing is that we now have parity with ARM templates. So all the fancy ARM template features are now also available in Bicep, so that you don't have to live with reduced functionality. And also very important, this is now officially supported by Microsoft support. So that means that you can now start touching your production environment using Bicep if you feel comfortable with that. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, I'm still here for some more minutes. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks for conference for organizing the conference, Drago. Thanks to the sponsors that make this happen, and I'm looking forward to hopefully to the next show for of the CloudEight conference show. So see you soon. Bye bye. Thanks.